From the News Channel 5 network, this is OpenLine.
And I pledge this to you. I will be a president for all Americans. All Americans. And I promise you, I will fight as hard for those who did not support me as for those who did.
So there was President Joe Biden earlier today giving his inaugural address. Truly a remarkable day, a day for the history books. And what we want to talk about, I bet many of you watched a lot of the inauguration unfold, want to hear your thoughts. You've heard a lot of other people talk about it, certainly want to hear what you have to say about it. And there's just so much going on. There's so many angles that you can look at this from and kind of dissect. I'll read some of Biden's executive orders. He's already been busy. He's signing about 15 executive orders on his very first day. I'll go through some of those, but just kind of hear from you, your thoughts. We also are very happy to have with us Dr. John Weil, MTSU Political Science professor, joining us from an office there in Murfreesboro. Thank you at the college, the university. Thank you, Dr. Weil, for being here.
Glad to be here.
So
quite an exciting day.
A big day. Very exciting. Absolutely. These are always fun to watch, and there's so much that was unorthodox about this, like this whole year, and still there was some of that history that we can talk about. But I also want to talk about, you wrote an article in the Tennessean about presidential pardons.
I did.
And so you've studied that, you've looked at it. Certainly, as we woke up this morning, that was the news. Former President Trump had pardoned a lot of people. So what did you think?
Well, it almost got buried, and I think it was very purposeful. I had heard for days that a pardon was likely, and I stayed up till about 11, finally called it quits because I knew today would be a busy day. But he issued something like 143 pardons, and some had been recommended by, justice agencies, and some were very warranted. But there were a number of them, particularly to Steve Bannon, who, collected money, he said, for the wall between the U.S. and Mexico, and apparently put it in his bank account. And the article that I wrote, I have an encyclopedia that I wrote on proposed amendments to the Constitution. And one of the proposals that I like proposed that there be a moratorium. It suggested October 1st. I think November 1st would probably work, but that a president not be able to issue pardons from, say, that November 1st until the new inauguration, particularly a departing president. Because if a sitting president, especially one who's going to run again, issues a pardon, and he does it in a time, before an election, we can say, well, we favor it or we don't favor it. We think it was just or unjust. But a departing president like Trump basically can pardon anybody he wants to without any electoral or legal consequences.
And it's always been that way. So how unusual is it? I mean, how unusual is it? There's Steve Bannon, for a president to pardon somebody that was in his inner circle. How unusual is it? George Bush pardoned a number of people in the Iran-Contra scandal as he was leaving. Bill Clinton pardoned a number of people who had contributed to his campaign. He pardoned his brother Roger for, if I remember, minor drug offense or something like that. But it's fairly, and Obama issued, if I remember, close to 300 pardons, although most of them were not controversial. They were basically people who had been stuck in jail for 10 or 20 years for, possessing an ounce of marijuana or something like that. But the point is, we literally did not know until 12 o'clock today if Trump was going to pardon members of his family or even himself. And there's great constitutional argument as to whether one legally can pardon oneself. But imagine what a wrench that would have thrown in today's proceedings if instead of following the incoming president around, we were debating whether, Trump could legally pardon himself. Wow. And I like the idea that just move back the power to pardon to a time when voters may have some say, right before the election.
Yes.
And has that gained any traction? Is that something that's being talked about in big circles? What about that idea?
Well, I mean, it'll probably gain some more. Once people read my article, I'm sure it'll be adopted.
Good.
It tends to get, these proposals are generally made. A number of them were made at the time that Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. But in Ford's favor, and it was not a pardon that I particularly favored, but to his credit, he did it fairly early on. People had a year or two to mull it over before they decided whether they were going to elect him or not.
And some people said that was something that cost him, right?
I think it did. And again, I think if you think a pardon is important enough to give, then you ought to be willing to stand behind it, whatever the electoral consequences. And I think Ford was that kind of person.
And so that news almost did get buried. I saw it.
Purposely.
I was up kind of late last night. I did see that happened, and certainly there was a lot of talk about it right as President Trump was leaving and that kind of thing. But then we have a new president. He's issuing executive orders. That's almost old news.
Yes, it is.
But it's worth talking about, and so I'm glad we've talked about it. But I want to ask you your thoughts on the day.
Okay.
What did you think as you watched today?
I was very stirred by it, particularly because, it's just 2 weeks to the day after the riot, the insurrection at the Capitol. Someday we're going to realize how close we came. I mean, think about it. We have, 3 coordinate branches of government, and one apparently dances a jig or fiddles while the other is being attacked. At least 4 or 5 people die. People are injured. People are running through the Capitol, with Confederate flags, or using an American flag to beat a police officer. I mean, this is, it's like entering the Holy of Holies and sacrificing a pig, frankly. It's just beyond the pale.
And so do you think this speech, the inaugural address, met that moment? Did it, looking back on history, I think you're right. We will be astounded by some of the facts you just laid out. I mean, it's traumatic enough to live through it. And I think we're still just all processing it. I mean, as you laid it out, it was a remarkable moment. How does this speech fit in with that moment just 2 weeks ago, and the intense security that was there, and just kind of where we are right now as a nation?
2 people have acted particularly presidential in the last 3 weeks. And one of them was Mike Pence, who, in my judgment, probably had sufficient reason to evoke the 25th Amendment if he could have gotten a majority of the cabinet, and I'm not sure that he could have. But he's acted presidential. He's actually done something while Trump has sort of hunkered down. And the other person who's been very presidential for the past, since November 3rd, November 10th, whenever the election was finally called, has been Joe Biden. I think he's gone out of his way not to be provocative. I will say the one good thing that I know from Trump, although I don't know the contents, but apparently he did not concede, which is a long-standing tradition in American history. He did not attend the inauguration, which, the last president who refused to do that was Andrew Johnson. But he did apparently leave a note in the desk there for Joe Biden, and apparently the note was conciliatory. And I take that at least as, as a partial positive sign that maybe we're on the road to some healing and reconciliation.
Well, he certainly spoke, and I don't remember that other presidents have spoken like that. He held kind of this rally, this awkward kind of rally as he was getting on Air Force One, and it was important to him that it be Air Force One, and flew away, and that all seemed, I don't know, petty was how some described it. Others may describe it differently. I don't know. It didn't seem unifying, that's for sure. And so I have heard that he left a note. I had not heard that it was conciliatory. It would be interesting to know exactly what was in the note.
Well, we'll eventually find out. I don't know, how long, again, I'm taking Biden's word that it was conciliatory. It might have said something that wasn't worth repeating. But, one of the things that I found emblematic of the final, departure was playing "I Did It My Way." And, it's a great song, but did Trump do it the American way? And I think the answer is really no, he did not. He broke just about every norm that we have. At a time when the nation needed the healer, he continued to insist falsely that he had won an election by an overwhelming majority. The truth is, Biden beat him in the Electoral College by the same vote that Trump beat Hillary Clinton and declared it an overwhelming victory.
Yeah. So I want to get people to call in. We'll start taking calls. We'll open up the phone lines. I want to give everybody a chance to speak. Whoever wants to call in, and who's on line one? Ronnie. Okay, so let's just start taking calls. What do you say?
Absolutely.
Ronnie, hello.
Yes, sir.
Go right ahead.
We got a new president, like it or not. If you're Democrat or Republican, well, actually, Democrats like it. That's fine. Trump's gone. I'm trying to figure out. Let's leave it alone. Everybody seems like we're going to bash him to death, even though he's out of the picture now. A question to the feller sitting there. If you can answer this question, I've asked this 3 or 4 times. We're beating the Capitol to death with, people going in. I understand that. People did get killed. What's the difference with that than cities getting burned down? New York, Oregon, Chicago, I think it was a lot worse in those other cities that the mayors, and they weren't willing to call in the National Guard. I'm going to leave it at that. If you can answer that question with an honest opinion of what's the difference, help me out there. I'm trying to figure out right and wrong. Thank you.
Ronnie, I appreciate your sincere question. I feel like you're asking it sincerely, and I know that you are not alone. So, all right, Dr. Val, what do you think?
I think in many ways his question is absolutely on target. To the extent that people are, it's senseless. If somebody is killed, even if it's unjustly, what good does it go to burn down a business, to shoot at a police officer who wasn't involved? And often it's the very communities where the crime has occurred that end up getting burned down. So, I have no sympathy. I have great sympathy for people who stand up for what they believe. And that, that certainly includes marching in the streets and giving one's opinion. But I don't have any sympathy for people who burn down buildings, shoot police officers, commit mayhem. The only difference, I would say, is, if they had been attacking a state capitol or the U.S. Capitol, I do think that has a little bit greater sanctity. It gets a little bit closer to what the core of the Constitution is than a city. And of course, many of these cities, they are, they're under direction of mayors. And I think some of them were very pusillanimous. I think they did, sometimes they did not show sufficient force. They permitted mayhem to occur that should not have. So, I think one can be against both. Violence is not the way that we ought to be achieving political objectives in the United States.
Is one worse than the other?
Well, it's sort of like what Ronald Reagan used to say, the difference between a recession and a depression was in a recession somebody else lost their job, and in a depression you did. So if you live in one of these cities and your business is burned down, then I suppose that's as serious to you as if somebody invades the Capitol. But again, the Capitol is a greater symbol of the nation as a whole. And, not that we would want to lose a city or a city block, but that doesn't have the same emblematic quality as if somebody, actually attacks the U.S. Capitol.
Okay, let's go to Jamal. Hello, Jamal.
Hi, I want to comment on the commenter, not the gentleman that's here, but he asked if he wanted an honest answer. The protests in all these other cities are mainly because of people who are being persecuted by this country for their life. People are dying on the streets because of old laws that have not changed. The attack on the Capitol was an attack against this country. A foreign flag was waved in our national capital. I mean, anywhere else in the world, that would be an act of war. And then lives were lost due to that action brought on by a president who should be arrested for murder. And I mean, at the end of the day, this is not about tearing down a nation. This is about putting the nation back together and recognizing that we owe. I mean, you paid the Indians, you paid the Japanese intern camp. At some point, you have to stop killing black folks and face that and have this live conversation where we say, hey, you know, we can't keep going the path as we're going and looking at what we haven't done. If the South want to rise again, maybe they need to leave the country because it's not going to rise again. Have a good night, Ben. Sorry for that.
Well, Jamal, thank you. I mean, I appreciate your call as well. And in these first two calls, we see the division, and we see where people are coming from. And it's it's divided. It's far apart.
If I can just add, if black lives are in danger, then white lives are in danger too. If you can break into a black person's house without, due cause, the same thing can happen to a white person. So, we tend to see it in black and white, but the gentleman is right. There are laws, we need to re-examine laws on chokeholds and use of force. We need better training. We need to make sure, as the first caller points out, when police are fearful for their lives, they do sometimes overreact. I'd probably do the same thing. So we need a complete rethinking, not just on behalf of African Americans, but on behalf of all Americans.
And you see now these calls. I mean, Joe Biden today saying we need to call for unity. But you see the division that is there.
Yes.
How optimistic are you, as political science professor? You study this. As far as how divided we are, how optimistic are you that we can move towards some unity?
I'm sort of holding. I mean, I have hope. We've survived. We've survived the Civil War. We've survived world wars. We've survived Vietnam. Protests, all kinds of things. I'll feel a little bit better once the impeachment trial is over. My own preference, I think, would have been either to have an immediate trial and get it over with before the new president is there, or to do a censure. They've decided to do something else. I am concerned that, it's a little bit like the pardon. Instead of concentrating on what Biden is proposing and what the country needs the next couple of weeks, the Chief Justice of the U.S. as well as the Senate is going to be tied up possibly for weeks on this trial.
And that's unprecedented too, right? There's never been an impeachment trial for a president who's out of office, right?
No, well, I mean, two precedents. One, we've never impeached a president twice. And secondly, you're right. Now, there have been two impeachments in U.S. history of people who have left office. One, by the way, was about, we had the anniversary about 3 or 4 days ago. It was from William Blount of Tennessee, who was impeached as a senator and tried after he left office. And another was in 1867, if I remember, for a Secretary of War. But neither precedent is conclusive because in neither case was there a 2/3 vote. So we honestly don't know, if there is a 2/3 vote, which I think is unlikely, but if there is to convict Trump, then there's another decision, which is, are you going to bar him from future office? And my guess would be if they get the 2/3 vote, then they'll go ahead and do that. But I think it's more likely that you don't quite get to 2/3, and then he can still run again for office. And, we know that the last time he was impeached, for whatever reason, his popularity actually increased. He used it as sort of a badge of honor, sort of I'm a martyr. People are out to get me.
All right, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to start taking calls. We have Lucy, Larry. I want to give them plenty of time. But I want to ask you, Dr. Val, one more thing. I mean, do you think Biden should just step in and say, let's not do this? Could he politically do that? Is that the smart thing to do? There's so much pressure on him from the left to move forward with this. I think he may feel like it's justified based on the actions, but do you think it would be more prudent to drop it and move on and try and put all this behind us? What do you think he should do?
I honestly don't know what I myself would do. I personally think if inciting a mob and not intervening when you could intervene against something that could have resulted in the loss of life of scores of members of Congress, if that is not a high crime and misdemeanor, I don't know what would be. I mean, I just can't think of anything, unless it's a proverbial going on Fifth Avenue and shooting somebody like, he claimed early on. I guess the primary thing is hopefully Biden has enough savvy, and I think he would, to know there's no use issuing a request if it's not going to be honored. And I think, remember, and it's hard to be a judge in your own case, but many of these people in this trial were cowering in their offices. They were making calls home, not sure they were coming home that night. And that's, fear is a pretty big motivator. And, it is important that the message be sent that this is totally out of character with the responsibility. The president is supposed to be executing the law, not allowing the execution of members of a fellow branch of government.
Okay, yeah, it's a fascinating sort of debate. All right, we're going to take a break. Then we'll just start taking more calls. Lucy, Larry, others. Take a break. Be back right after this.